Good morning, guys. Sorry, I'm running a little bit late today. It's about 5 minutes after 11, so hopefully you haven't left me yet. If you're here, let me know that you're here. I have had a busy morning. That is why I am jumping on here a little late today. I apologize for that. Yeah, I've just had like a lot going on this morning. Don't know what you have had going on, but let me know. Let's see what I can announce today. Well, it's Thursday, July 31st. Welcome to another episode of the Healing Hour. I am your host, Sarah O'Brien. The Healing Hour is sponsored by the Let's Be Diverse podcast that is hosted by Andrew Stout, who is a friend of mine. And so that is a fantastic little working partnership that we have going on. He has some cool stuff coming up. And one of my buddies, Chasen Forehand, will be speaking at something that Andrew has helped organize. So go check those things out. That's that. So I'm trying to get my brain on. Who's here with me? Leanna. Steadfast and true. Good morning to you. I hope it's cooler where you are, right? It's super hot here, but it's going to be nice this weekend. You're in Minnesota. Do I have that right? I think Leanna's in Minnesota. I don't know. I can't remember this. I know you tell me every week. Thank you for being here, Leanna. I am happy to see you. I need to get my new slide deck up here. I realized I did not have the correct opening slide. I can't even get my words on right. Like get my brain going this morning. I didn't have my opening slide correct, so I needed to get that changed. So bear with me while I get my slide deck up. All right, here we go. Again, if you're here, let me know. I will try to give you a little bit of airtime and give you a shout out as I move through, again, quite a bit of content today. So let me just give you a rundown. July, I had a lot of travel and some things going on. So we only ended up with 3 shows, even though there were 5 Thursdays in July. And so because of that, and I knew I was going to be out, I decided to do topics around what I specialize in psychotherapy treatment. So for those of you that don't know, I am a licensed clinical social worker. I practice here in Virginia, licensed also in Maryland through my private practice. I've been a practicing clinician for over 15 years. And the things I specialize in my treatment are anxiety and addiction and trauma. And so over the course of my 15 plus tenure in clinical work, I've refined some of the way I practice via neuroscience research and information. And so neuroscience informs how I treat anxiety, addiction, and trauma. And I think it also explains really nicely how these things work from like a brain and physiology perspective. And my whole idea for that, number one, this is how I practice. Number two, this is how it makes sense often for clients when we're talking about change and ways to change the brain so that they move into healthier behaviors. And number three, this is the Healing Hour podcast. And I think one of the ways that we get collective healing is with collective understanding. And so if we have an understanding that anxiety disorders and addiction disorders and trauma disorders are brain-based and physiological-based disorders, then maybe we can reduce some stigma, judgment, and potentially unhelpful behavior towards folks that maybe have difficult behaviors related to these disorders. Oh, look who popped in. Hello, my buddy, Chasen. So Chasen and I got to meet in real life a couple of weeks ago in New York, and it was so exciting. And I got to meet his lovely wife, and my spouse was there. And it was not enough time. 2 hours was not enough time, but it was better than none. So happy to see you. And Chasen's been doing so much stuff. Go check out HR4U and Transformation Kitchen and see the cool stuff he has going on. There's a big event coming up in October. Oh, I'm so glad to hear this. Jason's been loving the latest content, my work around addiction. So glad. And for those of you who don't follow me on LinkedIn, he's also referring to posts that I've had on LinkedIn about benzos in particular last week, and sort of breaking down the neuroscience of addiction via posts and microdosing content, micro learning content. So go check that out. Jason knows I'm the spouse of somebody with addiction. My spouse has been in recovery now for about 8 years. And so not only is this something I treat in my practice, but it hits very near and dear to me. So today we're going to be talking about trauma, but before I get into that, let me do a check-in real quick and 3 deep breaths. And we're already about 15 minutes in and I have lots of content. So I want to get going. Like I said, I'm coming from a meeting. I'm starting a new position at a university as a faculty liaison to field work for clinical master's level social work students. And so that's exciting. It's a new role I'm going to step into this fall. It starts in August. And we had a meeting today. And then I even had to jump from that meeting early, and I had my own telehealth appointment with my doctor. And so that's why I'm running a little bit late. That was at 10:30 and it ran just a little bit over. So I'm like all over the place, which is why I'm talking real fast. And I'm like this morning. So let me take my 3 deep breaths, take them with me so we can get grounded in the space, and so that I can calm myself and be able to give you all educational information in a way that makes sense. So in through your nose, out through your mouth. Number 1, here we go. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale slowly. Inhale. Exhale slowly. Okay. Back to my slide deck. I'm feeling a little more connected. Grab your coffee, grab your water, grab your notebook. Today might be something that you want to jot some things down. Thank you so much, Jason. Cheering for you, Sarah. I appreciate that. It's so wonderful when you're here and interact with me. Okay, neuroscience and trauma. What do we know? Trauma becomes embedded in the brain, mind, and body. It directs our behavior, shapes our social habits, and profoundly informs the ways we navigate the world. Trauma is an inner injury. Trauma imprints itself into our neurobiology, leaving a footprint in the nervous system. Really like that definition that I came across in my research for this. So I told you guys last week, it took me 5 hours to review articles and organize information to make my slide deck for the Neuroscience of Addiction podcast last week. This one didn't take quite as long, but it still took a while, probably about 3 hours of pouring through stuff that I had and trying to make it all make sense for you. So like I said, this month you guys are getting basically free adult educational webinar trainings on this stuff because of how much work I put into making it succinct and for me to be able to talk about in 45 minutes to an hour. So we're going to talk about what trauma is, how do we define it, brain parts and brain chemicals involved, the neurophysiological responses to trauma, and the neurophysiological impact of trauma. We're going to talk about the behavioral impact of trauma. We're going to look at what happens inside the body when we experience a trigger or activation, the effects of childhood trauma, and trauma and mental health, and a little bit on current treatments. Like I said, we get a lot of stuff here today. If it doesn't make sense, please let me know. I'll do my best to answer your question live on air. If I don't answer it here, I'll do my best to answer it post live podcast in the chat on LinkedIn. If you want to send me a direct message, you can. Again, I hope this is going to make sense. My aim always is to take these sort of complicated concepts and put them in everyday language for folks as much as I can, while also keeping the integrity of the science and the neuroscience intact as I explain and educate on these things. So I'm going to do my best. Trauma is an inner injury. This is what I like. Okay, so if you think about physical trauma, like you get in a car accident and you get a concussion, or you break a bone, that's a outer injury. So trauma is an inner injury. So rather than an event, and it doesn't have to be a specific event, and that's not exactly what it is. Trauma is what happens inside of us instead of an actual event that occurs outside of us. Trauma is the fracturing of the self that manifests in the form of disintegrated neural patterning. So that means that your neural networks and the pattern of your neural networks are disintegrated. That means they're not integrated, they're not functioning the way that they should. Trauma impacts on one's body, sense of self, emotional and empathetic processing, and relationships. Trauma is an internal wound, that's this inner injury that impacts multiple biological systems involved in human development. Lack of self-regulatory capacity lies at the heart of this disintegration. So the neural disintegration that occurs with an inner injury of trauma shows itself in a lack of ability to self-regulate when we feel something. So that's emotionally, and that's physically, right? If we emotionally are feeling something, especially if it's uncomfortable, or physically feeling something that is uncomfortable, and you have an experience of trauma that has like fractured these parts of you and interrupted your normal neural network patterning, then what the result is the inability to regulate. And this shows up as chaos and or rigidity in our relational, so our relationship functioning and our neural functioning. So what happens in the brain can be chaos or rigidity. So either like all over the place, and that's the disintegrated neural patterning, or it's very rigid, like it's learned a new way and we can't deviate. And neither one of those is how it's really supposed to work in our brain. During trauma, people instinctively go into a stress response. This is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn mechanism, and this gets triggered. And so they are going to do one of those things in an effort to self-preserve. So if you're in a trauma situation or you start experiencing the trauma in your body, your physiological system, without you thinking, if you remember what I talked about with the amygdala, so without you thinking, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn is going to happen. And this is going to be an attempt to save yourself or protect yourself. Let's see here. Okay. Brain. Okay, before I jump into this, let me go to this question by Chasen as I'm reading it. Chasen says, what do you say to organizations that say discussing trauma is more woke or woo and isn't appropriate? He says, and then I know teach you up. Right. Like, what can I say? What the fuck is what I'm going to say about that? Like, do you know anything about trauma is my first question to these organizations. Do you know the neuroscience of trauma? Do you know anything about trauma-informed care? Do you know anything actually about it in like the 50 years or more we've been studying it and know? Because if you're saying that it's woke or woo, then you have no idea. There is so much of trauma that's embedded in science, in neuroscience, in neurobiology, in biology, in brain function, in physical body function. And it has a lot more to do with that actually than what we want to think about with like emotional or spiritual or even psychological function, even though emotional and psychological and spiritual function all are demonstrated via neurobiology and neurophysiology and neurophysiological function. So I think trauma has gotten misused, misappropriated, misdefined, and overused in media, in the world, in the social world. If you can think back to like somebody who maybe had, hot and cold mood, then somebody would say something like, oh, you're so bipolar. And that's not really the correct way to use that. Right. I think the same is happening with trauma, and especially with trauma informed care for folks that are honestly less informed, because if you're informed, then I think it's really difficult to say that. Yes, there are body-based and somatic interventions to treat trauma. People think those are very woo. Those are very much based in science and vagus nerve research, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. And so And at this point, especially post-pandemic, you can look for research and statistic on this. Almost like every person globally, worldwide, has a lived experience of trauma, which means, nearly 100% of people could have this inner injury impact because of trauma, which is why we need to be talking about it. And it's probably why it's coming up more in mainstream conversation, but too many people are probably talking about it that don't actually know about it. That's what I say about that. Um, and Jason gives me a strong arm and a prayer, right? And I know you understand this as well. And today, I hope I'm going to, direct all those organizations that think it's too woke or too woo and isn't appropriate. You may direct them to this podcast where I'm explaining this information. And for anybody that knows me, I am trying to expand my awareness and my repertoire in terms of healing trauma, including what some people would call woke or woo things. But that's not where I come from. I am trying to be more open-minded to things that work for people and not cutting myself off at the nose. But I really come from a science-based perspective. I have a science degree, and science is how I understand mental health disorders, and science is how I understand mental health disorder treatment. And so I really come from that perspective in my clinical practice. And personally, I'm trying to expand to more things. And I'm, of course, open to hearing more things, but science is the name of my game most of the time. Okay, back to brain parts and chemicals. So brain areas implicated in the stress response include the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Now, we talked about the amygdala and the thalamus and the cortex when we talked about the neuroscience of anxiety. So a lot of the same processes here. And the amygdala, we know, is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn center. And so that also plays a part in addiction and also plays a part in anxiety, and of course plays a part here in trauma. It's a very important part of the brain for reactivity, basically, and overreactivity to things, and your body and your brain learning to react for certain reasons. Traumatic stress can be associated with lasting changes in these brain areas. So lasting changes in the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. As a reminder, the amygdala is the response center for danger and safety, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And in trauma, the amygdala becomes overactive. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for thinking, reasoning, and decision making. This is our higher level executive functioning. The prefrontal cortex evolution is what makes us human. The prefrontal cortex, that means thinking, reasoning, and decision making, becomes impaired when we're talking about trauma. And the hippocampus is involved in verbal declarative memory. So this is being able to verbally explain, see, understand a memory. It is very sensitive to the effects of stress and trauma, and our ability to verbally declare memory becomes ineffective with trauma. And this might make sense to people because we don't always remember our trauma in terms of like words and pictures in our brains, like that are visual, especially if you have early childhood trauma. This is often an effect that lives in your body. And so our body knows that we experience trauma, but your hippocampus cannot bring that out into a declarative verbal memory. And so some of the chemicals involved in trauma are cortisol and norepinephrine. And these two neurochemical systems are critical in the stress response as well. More on brain parts and chemicals. Let me give an example. For instance, when an individual is a victim of an assault, epinephrine or adrenaline or norepinephrine, so epinephrine or norepinephrine, floods this person's brain and gives the person a rush of energy via the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system operates without us having to do anything. You don't have to input. This is like automatic. This is breathing, swallowing, digestion, things like that. So if you are assaulted, physical injury, your brain is going to pump out norepinephrine, and this is going to give you a rush of energy. This is an instinctive stress response. This can cause a startle response, queasiness in the stomach, and heightened blood pressure. And all of this happens with that rush of energy and the increase of adrenaline. And it's so the person can survive this assault by either fighting or fleeing the offender. So we need that rush of energy to fight, 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 flight, flee, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And really, like the rush of adrenaline is going to help us fight or flee, right? So get away from this situation where somebody is physically assaulting you. So there's a release of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which is a naturally occurring steroid that reduces the inflammatory response. So this also encourages survival and beta endorphins to reduce whatever pain you may feel from the physical assault. So cortisol is pumping out because your body is under stress and duress. If you're physically being assaulted, it makes sense cortisol is going to come out. Adrenaline is for something different, but cortisol says, hey, your body, your physiology, your brain is under stress, under duress. And so the cortisol comes out to try to help solve that issue. Okay. So that's how the brain parts and chemicals work together to have a response to trauma. And this just happens to be an example of physical assault or physical trauma. So let's talk about the neurophysiological response to trauma. During a traumatic stress response, the brain and other parts of the nervous system mobilize neurophysiological processes to cope with the stressor, kind of like producing cortisol to motivate fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and to like sort of take care of your internal system that is stressed. So prolonged activation of brain regions involved in the stress response. This is the amygdala, this is norepinephrine, this is cortisol, this is the hippocampus, this is the prefrontal cortex, right? So when we have prolonged activation in these areas of the brain and an ongoing release of neurochemicals like cortisol and norepinephrine and adrenaline, that comes with experiencing trauma, this reorganizes the brain mind-body system. Okay, so if you have prolonged activation in these areas of the brain due to trauma or repeated trauma, what happens is a changing of the way your brain functions. Like literally the physical functioning of your brain changes. It reorganizes what goes here, how messages get sent, by who and at what intensity, right? All of that is impacted negatively by trauma. This results in a compromised ability to prepare for and adapt to things in the face of stress, adversity, or daily challenges. The brain's response to trauma can result in difficulties with memory retrieval and emotional processing. More on the neurophysiological response. Exposure to trauma can cause the brain to rewire itself. This is that reorganization of the brain mind body system, leading to alterations in neural pathways. That's that disintegrated neural patterning. So rewiring means it's supposed to go like this, and instead they're going like this, and they're connecting sort of in different ways. Trauma can affect the salience network, which is crucial for learning and survival. This network helps individuals distinguish between safe and threatening environments. Disruption to this salience network can lead to heightened anxiety and difficulty in emotional regulation. Again, the salience network is just another aspect of brain function that is impaired, negatively impacted by prolonged activation due to trauma responses. Okay. And so then our ability to distinguish between safe and threatening situations becomes disrupted or impaired. And as a result of that, we can have a lot of anxiety where we don't need anxiety, and we can have a lot of reactivity where maybe we don't need reactivity. And then on top of that, we have difficulty regulating that reactivity. Okay, so those are the responses. So those are the things that happen as a result of trauma, the neurophysiological responses. Okay, the impact of that when people are exposed to ongoing stress or multiple traumatic experiences, this fear response in the amygdala gets triggered over and over again. A response that's meant to be temporary. So the fear response from the amygdala is meant to be temporary, only at the time in which you are in danger. And instead of that being temporary, it becomes more permanent in the nervous system. And this leads to a state of hyper alertness or hypervigilance. That's always scanning for something to go wrong or something to go bad or for trauma or danger to happen to you. This is not our normal state of being. We are not meant to live in a state of hyper alertness. It makes sense that we would want to be in a state of hyper alertness if we're in a danger situation or actively in a traumatic situation. The problem is because of trauma, the impact is that basically this gets like clicked on and stays on, even when you are out of the danger or trauma situation. That is a brain change as a result of experiencing trauma. This it just happens, and then you're hypervigilant, and it's not fun, and we have to deal with it, right? So, because we're hypervigilant all the time now with this more permanent occupation in the nervous system of like the amygdala being kicked on, basically, when we're in this state more permanently, non-threatening situations of many kinds can easily trigger or activate a fear reaction. It activates the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response in the brain to something that seems non-threatening. Okay, for somebody that has relational trauma, this may mean having basically a response as if somebody is trying to kill you when somebody's tone changes in conversation. That very non-threatening thing can easily trigger a massive reaction in somebody that has experienced relational trauma. That's how that can show up. So like I say here, it shows up in the real world as emotions overloading your cognitive ability to discriminate between safe, danger, or reward, right? So if we're able to access our prefrontal cortex and logical reasoning and decision making, we can say, oh, that person's tone that changed doesn't really mean anything. I'm not really in danger as a result of that. But due to the reorganization of the brain, mind, body system, what happens instead is that your cognitive ability to discriminate does not come online. We cannot access that part of our brain, so we cannot get to that logical reasoning. Instead, our amygdala gets kicked on and our emotions are going haywire, right? This is how the traumatized brain overgeneralizes towards danger. Some slight thing that's off says danger, 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 because that's better for us to pretend like everything is dangerous and to save ourselves than to miss something that is dangerous and have it hurt us. Okay, let me answer Chasen's question as a result of neurophysiological impact. Chasen asks, if we have created patterns of how we deal with certain events like crowds, tight spaces, etc., due to decades of past trauma, is that something we can overcome with time? I would say that is something that you can work to manage in better and healthier ways over time with an active willingness, potentially for a long time. Okay, so I would just use different words there that it's not necessarily something we overcome, but it is something that we can learn to manage better, learn to manage in healthy ways, and learn to manage in such a way that we like decrease potentially how much we're activated in crowds and tight spaces. So, with willingness and effort and a good trauma provider, you can learn to manage crowds, tight spaces better in the moment. So when your nervous system gets activated, you can learn some strategies, some somatic strategies, some body awareness strategies, coping strategies, number of other things to manage those better that maybe reduces your suffering and discomfort when you're in those spaces. Okay, so that's one part of the work. The other part of the work is changing your brain and that neural patterning back to the way that it's supposed to be so that in time, crowds and tight spaces don't kick off that same response to begin with. Okay, and this is like the beauty and the amazing, astonishing information we have of trauma and neuroscience research that we can actually change the brain. We can actually change it back. There are interventions that we can use that sort of reintegrate the neural patterning so that triggering or activating situations become less triggering, less activating, potentially to the point where they don't activate anymore at all, or the activation is so low impact that it doesn't disrupt functioning, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. It's a good question. Thank you for that, Jason. Okay, more on the neurophysiological impact of trauma. So, what I just said here previously is the traumatized brain overgeneralizes towards danger. Why does it do this? Trauma is rooted in the brain's predictions and construction of our experiences. Um, when an adverse experience becomes traumatic, the brain heavily weighs and anticipates that experience in its future predictions to avoid harm. This is the hypervigilance. This is the having an intense and extreme reaction to somebody's change in tone because it's heavily weighing and anticipating that that's going to turn into a traumatic situation that we need to protect ourselves from, rather than a non-traumatic situation that we can deal with in a different way. Okay, so this is another way your brain learns and gets primed for trauma. It is something that our brain does is it filters in negative experiences to a higher degree and filters out positive experiences to a lesser degree, right? So your brain saliency, right, it holds on to negative experiences more easily and more of them, obviously for survival purposes. If we had negative experiences or danger experiences or things where we got hurt either emotionally or physically, your brain is going to remember those more easily and like more vividly than positive experiences that you have in life, because your very survival depends on noticing those dangerous situations and acting sooner rather than later to save yourself. This is how it overgeneralizes to danger. And the more trauma you have, the more it's going to overgeneralize to try to protect yourself. So this ongoing prediction and re-experiencing of the traumatic event strengthens the neural connections associated with it, right? And so because we filter in the negative experience more, we think about them more. They're more vivid, right? Or more salient or more cemented in there. Anything that slightly reminds us of that, we're back to thinking of that, right? Like we just keep strengthening the neural connections between a trauma that happened and us doing the things that we need to do physiologically to save ourselves from that danger traumatic situation. So this makes the predictions more likely to occur in the future, also because we're looking for them, which maybe seems counterintuitive. Why look for them if we want to avoid trauma? But we need to look for them so that we can avoid trauma or take care of ourselves if it comes up, right? So one of the biggest things is this hyper alertness, this hyper vigilance. We don't want to be caught off guard because that might kill us. And if not physically, right, like extreme emotional impact to the point like it feels like dying. Okay. And so we want to avoid that. Nobody wants to experience that. So somebody that has experienced trauma before is more likely they will experience trauma again, prime for trauma, right? Unless we learn how to deal with this. And learn how to deal with this means changing your brain so it's not responding in the same way to non-traumatic stimuli, right? Like it's made an association. If you remember from my talk of neuroscience and anxiety, part of what triggers anxiety is our associations, right? So if we've associated a fire truck on the street with there being an actual fire, every time we see a fire truck parked on a street, we're going to start to get anxious. The same thing kind of works here with trauma, right? The association, and this might not be conscious, right? Because we're not talking about verbal declarative memory. This is like an association your body and brain has made, right? So if the association is a person's change in tone means I'm getting ready to get yelled at, get hit, get blamed, something like that, then that association means you're going to respond as if they've already yelled at you, hit you, or blamed you when the tone changes before they've even done that. That is how an association happens. And then that's how we get primed for trauma. Gosh, I hope that makes sense. So symptoms of trauma-related disorders like PTSD represent the behavioral manifestation. So what we see a person do, act, respond in behavior. This is behavioral manifestation of stress-induced changes in brain structure and function. What we see in PTSD, nightmares, hypervigilance, heightened anxiety, irritability, right? Some of those things. That's a behavioral manifestation of stress induced and a prolonged stress induced changes in your brain structure and function. The behavioral impact of this. So if we talk about the behavioral manifestations being a result of stress induced brain changes, what does that look like? That looks like even when the traumatic event has passed, the trauma activation, formerly known as a trigger. So I use these interchangeably so you guys know what I'm talking about, but we don't really use trigger anymore. We use activation. So when the traumatic event is passed, the trauma activation remains. That's the tone changing, even if it doesn't lead to getting screamed at, getting hit, or getting blamed, let's say. Okay, so the trauma activation remains for when tone changes. And I'm just using that as an example, guys, but that's one example. So the individual can easily be re-triggered or reactivated to feel that the danger has returned by things that look, sound, smell, or feel like, and feel like might be feels like internally, not like something we're consciously aware of or an emotion, but literally physiologically feels like things experienced at the time of a trauma. Okay, this is what an activation is. This is what a trigger response is. This is what nervous system activation is. It's your brain and body experience something, a sound, a smell, a feel. What I'm talking about with the tone is a sound. It's a change in tone, right? So that sound can reactivate you. That makes your brain and body think and assume you're in that same situation where you got hit, yelled at, or blamed, and it feels exactly like that situation, even if it's not that exact situation, right? Even if it doesn't lead to the getting yelled at, getting hit, or getting blamed, just the sound of the tone change can reactivate somebody into a whole trauma response as if they're reliving it in that very moment. Leanna says, very interesting. Agreed, my friend, right? This is how this works. I find this stuff also super interesting and also really accessible, right? Like this makes sense to me. I'm hoping I'm explaining it in a way that makes sense to you all, but this makes sense to me when, as a clinician, as I see all these behaviors play out in individuals, the brain science behind this makes sense for what I see them do, right? And then the brain science behind this makes sense for interventions that I use with them in treatment to change those brain things so that we see a different behavioral manifestation. Okay. When someone feels like, and this is not conscious, guys, this is not living in the prefrontal cortex and cognitive representations. This is a physiological brain body response, right? It does not have to be in conscious awareness. So when someone feels like the danger has returned because the tone changed, the brain automatically responds as if the danger has actually returned. It doesn't distinguish between this being a different situation, right? Leanna says, makes sense, 100, right? Exactly. Me too. So glad that it is. So let me say that again. When someone feels like in their brain or physiological system that danger has returned, and the example that I'm using is tone changed in conversation, the brain automatically responds as if the danger has actually returned in real time. This is not premeditated or thought about because it doesn't live in the prefrontal cortex. This isn't planned or calculated. This is a response, a brain response to things feeling like the original trauma. This is what a nervous system activation is. So if you hear somebody say nervous system activation, this is what's happening. People do not have control over these brain responses to their trauma. It just happens. So when you see somebody who has experienced trauma lashing out for apparently no reason, I can guarantee you there is a reason. It is brain-based. It is a self-protective measure, and they probably didn't have a lot of control over it popping out to begin with. We have to manage that by coping and having strategies in the moment. But the way that we actually resolve and heal that is a lot of brain-based intervention. What happens when triggered? We're kind of talking about it. It's like having this reminder, whether it smells like something, sounds like something, feels like something, and then your body and brain respond as if it's the first time when that was a traumatic situation, right? So I talked about the tone a little bit in the last sort of example. So here's another example of what happens when we're triggered or activated. Physical pain resulting from traumatic injuries, like that assault, are also mutually maintaining, with the heightened arousal causing muscles to become more tense and pain more intense, right? So, our very response to pain triggers a trauma response for when we experience pain during traumatic situation. Does that make sense? So we have heightened arousal to pain, meaning muscles will become more tense and the pain more intense. Increased levels of pain, just in general, from anything else that can act as a trigger, are then acting as a reminder of the traumatic events, in this case, maybe a physical assault, intensifying the brain's response and making pain even worse. That's how we're primed for trauma. So if you experience a physical assault and then you have heightened arousal, causing your muscles to become more tense and pain to become more intense. So that another time that you have pain, it's going to trigger more intense feeling to that pain as a trauma response. So the increased levels of pain equal the trigger, right? So you could have pain from something else. I talk about this with people. If you experience any other kind of pain, if you're sick and then you feel like you're going into a trauma activated space or reaction, that makes sense because that's like a lot for your brain and body to deal with. And the neurophysiological components of pain and experiencing pain trigger trauma responses, right? That stress response, it's the same. So this cascade model of PTSD results in chronic mental health and behavioral consequences such as stress-related discomfort, prolonged poor quality of life, and substance abuse to manage these triggers, right? So if you're a person that has experienced trauma before, particularly a physical assault, let's say, then your later response to pain is going to be heightened and more intense. That means something that's maybe not super painful, you're going to experience as more painful than maybe other people who haven't experienced trauma. Okay. And so as a result of that, you're experiencing stress or stress related discomfort more frequently because the things that trigger your pain response happen more easily and more intensely than people who didn't experience trauma, right? This is how we also get into that prolonged discomfort and stress. People didn't ask for this. This is what has happened to them. Because let me tell you, if it was a choice, somebody would not want to experience more frequent, more sensitivity, and more intense pain to things that essentially should be less painful or not very painful as a result of experiencing trauma before. This is not a choice. Nobody wants to experience that. That's just what happens. And because then we live in more both psychological, emotional, and physical discomfort, this is where it's very easy for somebody to fall into substance abuse or addiction as a result of experienced past trauma. That shit is uncomfortable. If you don't have a good guide, therapist, or any information, you're probably not dealing with it well or knowing how to cope with it well. And eventually it just becomes so immense that honestly, you just can't deal with it. And people need something to give them relief. And then this is how we use substances as it relates to trauma histories. Okay. I gave you a couple different examples, some of physical trauma, some of like relational or emotional trauma, how that happens in the brain. We get an overreactive amygdala to things like tone. We get heightened sense of stress and reactivity in the and then we get in the hippocampus, and then we get impaired reasoning, judgment, decision making in the prefrontal cortex. These are all disruptions as a result of trauma, regardless if you experience physical trauma like a car accident or emotional relational trauma like childhood abuse or an abusive relationship, domestic violence, narcissistic relationships, behaviors, those types of things. So, trauma exposure in childhood. This is physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, extreme invalidation and dismissal of feelings, being blamed or the family scapegoat, being compared to or treated differently than siblings. All of these things are considered exposure to trauma in childhood, and they have massive effects on development. So what I was talking about to you previously happens whether you experience trauma in childhood or in adulthood. Those are the brain changes that happen. The more trauma you experience, the more salient that gets, right? The more intense the physical pain, the more easily your amygdala reacts to something like tone or smell, right? So the more trauma experiences you have, the more associations your brain makes with those things. And then the more intense all of those reactions and responses are going to be for you. Sometimes these things are more time limited or shorter in sort of in recovery or reaction if it's a one-time traumatic experience, like one car accident, one physical assault, right? One experience of verbal abuse. Okay. Those are going to have impact on the brain. They are going to have less impact than anything that happens repeatedly or ongoing over an extended period of time or in multiple occasions. Brain scans highlight how early abuse rewires pathways associated with emotions, empathy, and bodily understanding. I find this super interesting. This is how we get disassociation and disconnection from our physical self. This is why if you experience early childhood trauma, dissociation is more likely to occur, meaning like your way to cope with that as a kid that you can't get out of the situation is to disassociate. I'm just going to leave my body, leave my brain and go someplace else and not be present when this abuse is happening. Okay. And so the impact on bodily understanding, and negative impact on bodily understanding makes sense to me. And knowing that disassociation is such a likely way to cope when you are a child who is experiencing abuse. And this often moves with you into adulthood. You could continue to disassociate when things are traumatic. Things either trigger the trauma or things are super uncomfortable emotionally for you or physically even. So because the brain rewires emotions, empathy, and bodily understanding, this often leads to difficulties in learning and decision making. Disruptions in the default mode network and the central executive network of the brain. You don't need to know exactly what those are and what they mean. And I don't either, because like I said, most of my stuff is fairly rudimentary knowledge of neuroscience because I'm not a neuroscientist or a clinical neuroscientist. Okay, but the disruptions in the default mode network and the central executive network of the brain, and these areas are crucial for self-perception and cognitive processing. So the central executive network would be up here in the prefrontal cortex, and the default mode would be the ability to look at self, understand self, feel self, be connected to self. And there are disruptions in these areas, and they show up in brain scans of children who have experienced trauma. That's the neuroscience, guys. Brain scans are giving us like everything we know as we run experiments, look at brain scans, and see what's happening in there. And this is how they've made these connections in neuroscience over time. Okay, disruptions in self-perception and cognitive processing, and these areas of the brain and the brain scans also show significant disruptions in neural networks critical for self-awareness and problem solving. So we're talking about impairment and negative impact in emotions. That's understanding emotions, naming emotions, experiencing emotions, understanding other people's emotions. In empathy, that's being empathetic towards yourself. That's being empathetic towards somebody else's experience. Bodily understanding, sensations, functions, needs, all impacting learning. So ability to take in information and retain it, decision making, logical reasoning, self-perception, how you view yourself, being connected to yourself, cognitive processing, language, Self-awareness. Do we even know what I'm putting out there? And problem solving. That is a lot of functional development areas that are negatively impacted to exposure to trauma in childhood. That is why the earlier you experience trauma, the more negative impact it's going to have, even if it's just one trauma experience. If you experience one trauma experience as a 6-month-old child, it is going to have a greater negative impact on you than if you experience 6 trauma experiences from age 25 on. That's also neuroscience research, guys. Okay, so this suggests that those under age 18 who've experienced trauma or abuse will likely struggle with emotions, empathy, and understanding their bodies. For children who experience trauma difficulties in school caused by memory problems and difficulty with hard mental tasks and impaired decision making are also likely to emerge. This leads us to wanting to ask the question of what happened to children that are acting out in school rather than what is wrong with them, because it's not normal functioning. If they can't make decisions, if they don't understand empathy, if they're having memory difficulty or performing tasks at their supposed cognitive level for learning, there's not something wrong with that child. Something happened to that child, and their brain does not function like other children. And that is something that we need to be aware of. So the personality develops in the presence of early traumas is not well adapted to adult life. So the personality that develops in an individual who is exposed to early childhood trauma is not well adapted to adult life. Traumatized children and adolescents face fundamental problems in basic trust, independence, and initiative. They are burdened by impairments in self-care, cognition, memory, identity, and the ability to form stable relationships. These are brain-based problems, folks. Impairments in self-care, cognition, memory, identity, and self-perception, and the ability to form stable relationships is not a personality disorder. It is a brain disorder as a result of trauma. It is brain changes as a result of trauma that manifest in behaviors that we see. But they are not a behavioral problem. They have trauma in their history, and their brain has changed as a result. As a result of these brain changes, they engage in what we see as difficult behaviors and poor adaptability to social, emotional functioning in life. So let's also say it like this. Even when a child who has experienced trauma is not thinking about their trauma, so it's not like it's in their prefrontal cortex and language and memory, right? And all those things. So when a child is not thinking about their traumatic experiences, their brains are still struggling to process the sensations within their bodies. And they're very disconnected from that. And they don't understand how that works. And this is also why disassociation happens, because those bodily sensations can be really uncomfortable and they don't know what to do with them and they don't know why they're there. This influences how a person thinks and feels about their internal world. So if you have bodily sensations like tightness in your stomach, sweating, shaking, as a result of some activation of the trauma in your nervous system as a child, but you don't know or understand what that is, you're going to start to think that there's something wrong with you when an adult talks to you. But really, maybe it's just that tone change, right? You're going to think there's something wrong with you, that you're so anxious to meet somebody new, right? This influences how a person thinks and feels about themselves, about their internal world. Subsequently, this influences their ability to empathize and form relationships. You can imagine if you get anxious every time you meet somebody new because of your early childhood trauma, and then you think there's something wrong with you because you're feeling anxious every time you meet somebody new, and you're not recognizing that it's a normal response to living through an abnormal situation, then you're going to think there's something wrong with you. And that's probably going to impact how you interact with new people, right? And then that's going to impact your ability to form relationships. And most of this is going to occur without your awareness that there's something wrong in your brain. You're just going to think that there's something wrong with you as a person. And this is more likely to occur if trauma exposure happened in childhood than if trauma exposure happened in adulthood. This feeling like there's something wrong with you is going to be more likely to happen if you experience trauma in childhood. Children depend on adults to survive. And when they experience trauma in early life, they tend to blame themselves for their pain responses, right? So this is crying. This is being dysregulated. This is big emotions. This is those body sensations like tension or shaking or sweating that they don't understand. And they're going to say like, I shouldn't do that. There's nothing wrong here. Or, I shouldn't feel like that. There's nothing wrong here, right? They're going to blame themselves for their pain responses, even though these responses are natural when exposed to trauma, abuse, or neglect, right? But this is what happens in their little brains that are developing, right? This is how they end up viewing themselves. This influence leaves children feeling like there must be something wrong with me when they have a natural trauma response, right? That's to the tone thing. It's like, why am I responding like that? What's wrong with me? And really, it's like nothing's wrong with you. That makes perfect sense based on what you've experienced, right? And as children, they don't understand, and they either weren't taught about it or they are blamed for it. They don't understand these responses. They don't understand these bodily sensations. They don't understand the connection between them. And if they are struggling with experiencing trauma from their primary caretakers, or their primary caretakers are neglectful, then even if they're not externally blamed, they're going to internally blame themselves for anything that's happening. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you guys with trauma in childhood. Trauma in childhood is significant. You know, the ACEs survey that came out really help us sort of start to pinpoint who has experienced early childhood trauma. And if we know that, even if they don't uncover that until they're an adult, we can understand tons of their behaviors and tons of the decisions they've made in life up to this point, whether they had positive or negative consequences, because we know what's happened to the brain if they experience early childhood trauma. Even if this adult now has no idea why they're behaving in the ways they do, they have no idea why relationships are fucked up the way they are. If they have no idea why they respond the way that they respond in certain situations, it's likely due to childhood trauma. And even if they're uncovering this in adulthood, we have an opportunity to educate and explain to people that it's not their fault, that there's not something wrong with them. This is a result of something that happened to them or something they've been through once or repeatedly. And good news is we know what areas in the brain that is affected. And good news is we know interventions that are actually helpful for changing those brain areas so that you don't experience the suffering anymore. Poor relationships, a lot of reactivity, anxiety, bodily discomfort, and dysfunction. Okay. How do we know all this? Neuroscience research. Using functional MRIs, researchers observed that people with PTSD had less signaling between the hippocampus and the salience network. The hippocampus is responsible for emotion and memory, and the salience network is responsible for, it's a mechanism used for learning and survival. So there is less signaling between emotion and memory and learning and survival. There's a disconnect there, right? So this is how you may not cognitively remember anything that had happened, but you've learned how to survive and then respond that way. So they're not talking to each other in a way that makes sense. There's less of that happening, which is why we see problems in memory, emotional reactivity, and a lot of like survival responses when we maybe don't need survival responses. So the fMRI showing the less signaling between these two areas of the brain leads us to the conclusion that I've told you here of like how that plays out in behavior. Research has detected also less signaling between the amygdala and the default mode network. So the amygdala is linked to emotion and the safety center for fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And the default mode network is an area of the brain that activates when someone is not focused on their outside world, meaning they're more focused on their inside world or what's happening inside of them. So there is less signaling between the amygdala and what's actually going on. Okay, so this is like the amygdala is firing, but we're not connected to what it is going on. There's less signaling there. That results in behaviors that we can see in people. Trauma exposed folks can become chronically hyper aroused, that hyper alertness, hypervigilance, because their bodies are giving them the wrong messages, less proper signaling about a threat, right? And so their body is telling them this is danger when it's not danger, or the reverse sometimes. And then that's how we walk into other traumatic situations, sort of based on learning. So we become chronically hyper aroused within our physiological system because your body is like going haywire. Like the internal system is basically going haywire. Like nothing is connecting well. It's not making sense. They're not talking to each other in the right way. They're not talking to each other enough. This is all internal processing, internal physiology, neurobiology that is impacted, that is different, that we can see in a brain scan of people that have been exposed to trauma. And so the good news about this is if we know where a change is happening in the brain, then we know how people can work around that change and develop resilience, right? So it's either responding to that change differently to cope better, or responding to that change differently to make a different association and change the brain back, not back, but new, but kind of back to the way it was supposed to be. All right, we're rounding the corner here, guys. I'm trying to make it as much as I can within this hour so it's not extra long for you. I hope all this is making sense. Hit me with your questions afterwards if you have them. Let's talk about trauma and mental health, because although it's very impactful, trauma responses, unless it manifests in the criteria that we have for PTSD, which is the only trauma diagnosis that we have in the DSM-5. So CPTSD is not in the DSM-5. Trauma reactions to things, although they are very impactful to functioning and to mental health and wellness, they're not necessarily considered mental health disorder, even though they impair in functioning. So trauma and mental health. So when it gets to be really severe, a network of brain regions known to regulate fear behavior at both the conscious and unconscious levels are severely impacted by trauma responses. We know this, the amygdala is impacted, right? And we also know, so the amygdala is those unconscious level, and the prefrontal cortex is impacted, which is the conscious level, meaning the associations that we've made between tone and moving into self-protected or survival mode is like a faulty association that we made as a result of trauma. So that's how both conscious and unconscious levels are impacted. So the central executive network in the prefrontal cortex is more active in those who have experienced trauma than in healthy children, which means those with trauma histories tend to ruminate and relive terrible experiences when they're activated or triggered, meaning they're more focused on that internal world, right? So they're ruminating, they're reliving their experiences, whether it's in like conscious declarative memory, pictures and words, or it's physiologically the body sensations and things happening sort of behind the scenes. They stay in that space longer. It is more active than in healthy children who did not experience trauma. And so even some new studies are finding that the default mode network, so the other one that we talked about that works sort of in conjunction with the central executive network, also plays an important role in mental health problems and is likely influenced by experiencing early childhood trauma, right? So ruminating and reliving things, as particularly ruminating, is indicative of other mental health disorders. It happens in depression, it happens in anxiety, it happens in bipolar disorder. So we know that there could be like a basis of trauma impacting later diagnoses of mental health disorders. Not always, and more research will need to be done, but likely could be, right? Because of the areas in the brain that it's impacting and the areas of the brain that we see impacted in mental health disorders, also via neuroscience. PTSD is driven by remarkable dysfunction in brain areas vital to fear processing and response. This is the overactive amygdala, and impairment in processing information and decision making in the prefrontal cortex. Withdrawal, like withdrawing from things, is a useful life-preserving response that reduces vulnerability to further injury, right? You experience trauma, you move away from it. It causes people to seek safety, to rest and recuperate after a shocking or traumatic experience. However, ongoing withdrawal for safety can lead to depression and substance use issues, right? So it's sort of a survival response to withdraw after you experience trauma. But we talked about earlier, like the stress response sort of takes up permanent occupancy in the brain when it's not supposed to. And so that if we always feel like if we move out of that withdrawal, we're going to be vulnerable to trauma or danger, then we will just stay in our place of withdrawal. And that can lead to mental health disorders like depression or substance use issues as ways to manage the discomfort of potentially experiencing danger or being vulnerable to experiencing danger, right? They would rather not, but that leads to its own dysfunction. Trauma-related disorders are highly debilitating psychiatric conditions with immeasurable social and economic costs. They affect more than 4% of the population, me being one of the 4% of the population. One person in that 4% is me, along with probably many other people that you know. Okay, current treatment for trauma. Many trauma-related symptoms come from brainstem level somatic sensory processing dysfunction, and it's cascading influences on physiological arousal modulation, so being able to regulate arousal, affect regulation, being able to regulate emotion, and higher order capacities like thinking and decision making in the prefrontal cortex. So lots of processing dysfunction in these areas. Current treatment for traumas focus on trauma triggers or activations, addressing the fearful thoughts and avoidance of trauma triggers, that withdrawal and avoidance. And that's great, right? So what do we do when we're activated? And both basically via physiological sensation or thought, right? Like, so those associations. So what do we do when activated? When there's a stimulus from the environment? If you go back to my neuroscience of anxiety, some of this will make sense to you as well, because an environmental stimulus can trigger anxiety, or thought can trigger anxiety, right? So it's the same thing. Physiological stimuli can trigger, activate trauma responses, as well as thoughts or associations made, like about tone, can lead to trauma responses. But if we just like treat managing the activations, we're only treating one part of the problem with trauma. So the other part is like treating the internal. So what happens when we treat activations and associations is like we're treating the external thoughts that we have, behaviors that manifest as a result. We're trying to learn healthier ways to manage when things feel uncomfortable. Okay, that's one piece of the work, right? The other piece of the work is somatic interventions addressing physical body sensations experienced during trauma. And when we use somatic interventions that address the physical body sensations, we're working on the internal physiology. And a lot of these body-based interventions will lead to brain changes, right? It's like it's going like from the inside out versus the outside in. So as a very rudimentary way of explaining that. So we do still need more treatments that focus on the broader cognitive and emotional disruptions caused by trauma, especially childhood trauma. This is social emotional learning. This is body awareness. This is self-perception. This is empathy, decision-making, cognitive functioning, memory, right? Like, so we need more treatments and interventions that address those things. The number one thing we can do for everybody, starting in childhood and even adults, is social emotional learning. If people start understanding their emotions and other people's emotions, how they look for them, how they show up in their body, and sometimes what to pay attention for in other people, we are already doing something about the negative impact of trauma and the ability to adapt well and form healthy relationships if we tackle social emotional learning. And that's just one piece that we can do more treatment I do this. I do a lot of things around the cognitive and emotional disruptions with trauma. This is why I specialize in treatment of trauma, specifically PTSD and relational betrayal trauma. And often those things occurred earlier in life and childhood. I do not treat children. I treat adults that experience early childhood trauma and like have not resolved and moved through that. So this would include interventions, like I said, for social emotional learning, relationship building, self-awareness, and other awareness for addressing memory and cognitive processing issues. Like I was sort of just saying, and how I treat those things. I hope that makes sense. That brings us through all of our content. And I forgot to change the slide too. So it should say understanding and responding to trauma instead of addiction here. And so a lot of these things will be helpful for you. Some freebies are the emotional intelligence ebook. That's part of that social emotional learning. Let's start understanding what that means. Mindfulness exercises will help you get in touch with your sensations in your physical body and being present with yourself in the moment instead of any of that depersonalization and disassociation, especially when you feel discomfort. So mindfulness and those exercises will help us stay present in our bodies in the present context when things get uncomfortable, something we are used to withdrawing from, avoiding, or dissociating from when we experience a trauma activation. Grab one of my compassionate self kits, the self-care kit, or the self-care love and growth workbook are great options to learn how to pay attention to what your needs are, what your emotions are, and how to take better care of yourself. Reconnecting with your inner knowing is going to be particularly helpful for people that don't feel like they can trust themselves in their decision making, especially if they've experienced early childhood trauma or betrayal or relational trauma in the form of domestic violence or narcissistic partner or something like that. We often don't trust ourselves, our decision making in our body cues, the things our body is telling us. My Reconnecting with Your Inner Knowing or Your Intuition workbook, that's only $9. And you can find on my website, www.sarahobrienlcsw.com, will help you get back in touch with that part of yourself in a healthy way. All of these workbooks are developed by me. As you guys know, I'm a practicing psychotherapist, and trauma is one of the things I specialize in treating in my practice. And so these workbooks are made with clinical practice in mind. A lot of the things in these workbooks are things I do with clients in psychotherapy, and I wouldn't put them in the workbook if they didn't work, right? If I didn't see this actually affect change over people's lives, I would not be selling it to you. These are things I would use myself. I have often used these things myself. And like I said, these are things I use with clients all the time, whether it comes out in like an actual workbook fashion. These are things that we talk about. These are homework assignments that they get. These are things that they practice. If you want to understand this better, want to understand emotional intelligence more, to understand others' emotions more, I can do skills coaching or psychoeducation coaching. So if you don't actually need psychotherapy treatment, but you want to understand these things better, just sort of in your one-to-one space or interpersonally, you can reach out to me for coaching services. If you want your organization to understand these things, particularly the impact of trauma on behavior functioning and things that may show up in the workplace, I am available for small and large business-to-business consulting for executive leaders, leadership teams, team leads, managers, anybody that sort of has some leverage in workplaces to teach other people and want them to learn this information. You can contact me and I can speak and train at your workplace. This is what I did this month, right? Neuroscience of anxiety, neuroscience of addiction, neuroscience of trauma. Go to my YouTube channel, and that's just YouTube/@timelesstherapist to catch replays of all the shows. Finally, just again about me, I'm a licensed psychotherapist in Virginia and Maryland. I am a trauma-informed leader and leadership strategist, and I am a trauma-informed coach and consultant, which means I speak and train on this. I also write on this. And if you are a mental health clinician, I also am a private practice consultant, since that's what I do in the business world. And that is just to let you guys know, I use trauma-informed principles and practices in all the work and all the hats that I wear. So even if you come to me for private practice consulting to start up your own private practice, I conduct that consulting work with trauma-informed principles in mind. And I know that my fellow therapists are some of the probably the biggest population of folks that have experienced adverse life experiences, traumatic experiences, or just difficulty in general, or have their own mental health issues. So you are in safe and capable and trauma-informed hands when you come to me for any service that I provide. I also like design fun, cute little goodies and merch in my free time as part of my self-care. So I have an online Redbubble shop. If you scan that QR code, you can go there and see all of my original designs on t-shirts, hoodies, notebooks, magnets, and more. Let's see. I lost my slide deck. Give me 1 second so I can get to my last slide. I don't know where it went. Let me go all the way through. I think I had one more slide here at the end. Yes. Okay. When do we need this? Because it has your affirmations on it. Okay. You matter. You are worthy. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. If you're watching the replay, thank you for that. If you have questions when you're watching the replay, just reach out to me or comment on it. I'm happy to answer. If you want more in-depth information or questions, please link up with me for skills coaching, even if it's just one session. If it's more than about 15 minutes of my time, it's awesome if I'm compensated for that because I have very limited time and I want you guys to be educated, but I also don't want to run myself ragged trying to do that. Again, the Healing Hour podcast hosted by me, Sarah Fargo O'Brien, LCSW in Virginia, is sponsored by Andrew Stout in Canada and the Let's Be Diverse podcast. Be sure to check out his podcast. Thank you to my buddies for joining in. Chasen, Leanna, Chasen, thank you for your great questions. And I hope those made sense to you. And I'm always available to help explain further if you would like. Tune in next week. I am back to being a little disorganized and I don't know what I'm talking about in August. I'm hoping I'm going to have some guests, but again, I'm not sure. So if there's anything that you want me to talk about, feel free to drop me a DM. I'm happy to address topics that people are interested in as well. Otherwise, I'll come up with something and I will be here next Thursday at 11 o'clock. Thank you for bearing with me and being a little bit late this morning and running a little bit over. I appreciate you. I'm just, like I said, little old me over here in Richmond, Virginia, pretty much a nobody. So if you are watching this, I appreciate you tuning in. And I really hope that it was helpful information for you. And can be helpful either for your compassion for yourself or your compassion for other people, and that we can relationally start healing, maybe in a collective way if we all understand this. Yeah, that's all for now. I will see you guys next week. Like I said, 11 o'clock Eastern on Thursday. And until then, have a good week.